Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Hordes Dairyman monthly webinar. My name is Abby Bauer, and I'm an editor for Hordes Dairyman magazine. I will serve as the host for today's program, which will focus on robotic milking systems, and more specifically, what we've learned about feeding cows that are milked in automated milking systems. If you're listening to the presentation live, you can have access to a PDF copy of the slides that you can print or save on your computer. That can be found in the handout section of the GoTo webinar control panel. Just click on the handout section and then there's a link to the PDF there. Also want to let you know if you have any questions for our speaker, please type those into the question section of that same control panel and we will answer those following the presentation. Our sponsor for today's program is AMS Galaxy, and we thank them for their support of our webinar. Today, we welcome Jim Salfer as our webinar presenter. Jim has served as an extension educator with the University of Minnesota for the past 28 years, and he's had a focus on dairy production systems. He's been involved in several on-farm research projects involving robotic milking systems with the goal of understanding how building design and management factors affect profitability and performance. Jim has been invited to talk about robotic milking systems across the country and around the world in several other countries. The focus of his educational efforts through the University of Minnesota Extension have been to develop programs that help farmers and other industry professionals understand the major factors and management strategies that drive dairy farm profitability. Jim grew up on a farm in Minnesota and has held a few other roles in the dairy industry prior to joining Extension. Some of his experience includes managing a feed department, working as a dairy nutritionist, working for an AI company, and managing a dairy farm. Jim, welcome to the webinar. Look forward to hearing your presentation, which is titled Managing and Feeding Cows in a Robotic Milking System.
Well, thank you, Abby. I sure appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. Hopefully, wherever you're at with your time zone, I sure appreciate you joining me today. And, you know, make sure you type in your questions. I know I get sick of hearing myself sometimes, so I'll try to cover some new things that are going on, at least in the upper Midwest here, and also some strategies that we've learned. Of course, obviously, with any kind of dairy program, one of the keys to success is really an excellent feeding management program. And the goal of every feeding program, whether this is a robotic system or a conventional system, is we need to obviously meet the nutritional needs of the cow, maintain cow health. You can read through there's optimized milk. We want it to be as economical as makes sense, right? And then labor efficient and cost effective feed delivery system. One challenge a little bit with the robotic system is you've got this sort of the robot you've got to deal with. And so it's kind of this intersection between nutrition, cow requirements, what they need. We've got our cows, and cows are a little bit different. We know there's several diets that really end up in front of the cow. The farmer and their goals and how they want to manage their feeding system, and then the robot. So that does make it a little bit more complicated, particularly with some free flow systems. I'll talk with some of our guided flow systems are really going much more like really a traditional conventional farm. But we've got our robot feed, we've got our feeding table settings, and we've got our milking permission settings that we all need to think about. So some of the recommended feed management, talk more about this later, but like any dairy feeding program, we really need excellent pre-calving management. And that's probably more important, at least I believe it's more important in a robotic milking system than it is in a conventional milking system, because in a robotic milking system, if cows aren't feeling the best once they calve, we kind of encourage them to go get milk. Well, here you're relying totally on them deciding to go get milk. So again, we want 80 to 90% of freestall capacity if we can, at least 30 inches of bunk space for our close-up cows. We also need to focus on the PMR, and I think this has gotten much better in the last half a dozen years or so. There used to be a lot of discussion really on the PMR pellet and on the PMR feed. And that's important, but I think it's important for all listeners to remember, whether you're a nutritionist, somebody working with farms, that 80 to 90% of the nutrients are still going to be provided through the PMR. So that PMR is really important in making a robotic system successful. And it really is that drives high milk production, but also helps drive cows to the robot. So here's the way I think about a robotic milking system, or maybe a conventional milking system. What it really does is if we have really good pre-calving management and diet, that's going to promote high post-calving intake. There's a lot of research projects on conventional dairies that'll support that. What that does is then we have cows that feel good. They're really healthy and they're looking for feed. And then that promotes high early lactation visits because they're feeling better. They want to get to that robot. When you fetch them in there, they like the feed. They're just much more active. That drives high PMR intake because of early lactation visits. We get more PMR intake. And of course, this kind of becomes a circle. The high PMR intakes makes them feel good, drives high milk production. And then really this is what we end up with, right? We want high producing cows. We want a healthy herd that's really successful. That's really ultimately our goal. So let's look at fresh cow management. I think that's some area too that we really need to talk more about and needs to be better in a robotic milking system. I really encourage people to do a special observation of these fresh cows because as I mentioned earlier, in a conventional system, if they're not feeling really well, we may see them, at least we're going to encourage them to go up and get milk. But it's important to observe rumination, activity and manure, because say a cow really likes a robot feed that you've got dialed in, but she's maybe not feeling the best. Well, what can potentially happen in a robotic system is she'll overeat that robot feed. She will not eat as much PMR. That'll even make the situation worse because then she'll get a little bit of subacute ruminant acidosis. She won't feel good. She'll get up and get milked, especially if you fetch them 3 or 4 times a day. And then they'll lay down. I'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk a little bit about milking permission settings. Again, I talked about the palatability, the PMR. We want those cows to really go up and want that feed. I'll talk more about fetching fresh cows. And ideally, and I'll show you some of our data that talks about feeding multiple feeds through the robot. You're going to see an emphasis here of really high quality, high digestible forages in the PMR so cows are active. So what happens if we feed a lot of high energy forages and we want fermentable carbohydrates in there, think of starches and sugars, but we don't want it too high that it throws them into an acidotic situation. And what that really does is it includes, that causes a rapid forage rate of passage. So here's what happens in a cow. So they kind of eat, they get filled up, and what you want is a really digestible forage because that exits the rumen then, and then the rumen gets empty. And then they go back up and they eat some more. And so that's really what we want. We get a lot of meal frequency that way. The cows feel good, they get up, they're looking around, and that's, again, ideally our goal. I really like, this is actually some research that was done over in Wisconsin a few years ago, but it shows factors related to income over feed cost. These are 32 Wisconsin farms. I believe they were all free flow farms. But one of the biggest factors was pounds of milk per visit. What that means is it's how much a cow gave each time she went to the robot. That does make some sense because we don't want a cow coming in and giving 8 pounds of milk in the robot. Ideally, we'd like her to give, 25 to 35 pounds of milk every time she comes into the robot. But the message here from a feeding standpoint is they didn't have individual cow intakes, but they did have whole herd intakes, and herds that had more PMR dry matter intake, kind of makes sense, probably related to total dry matter intake, had higher income over feed cost. Total dry matter intake is the next one. PMR starch, so higher, think about higher quality PMR is really what the moral of the story here is. A little higher energy, i.e. a little higher starch, a little lower cost of pellets, so a little cheaper pellet. But this again points to the fact that we want really high quality PMR. You don't want a poor quality pellet, something that they're not going to eat. But from a nutrition standpoint, try to make as much nutrition as possible in that PMR. I think this is a slide. I got this from a friend of mine, a robot farm that I work with. And what I like about this is just shows how important consistency in the forages are. And what happened here, you can see with the vertical yellow lines, what happened is, and they knew this was coming on the farm. They switched from alfalfa, this was an upright silo, and they were going to a sorghum silage that was really, really high quality. So it wasn't that the quality was a lot less, and they were very prepared for it, but it was a pretty abrupt change because we had to in an upright silo because we didn't have other forages available with cow. But you can see in a very short period of time, milk yield dropped about 10 pounds, free time went up, and you saw milk per robot dropped about 400 pounds, and it took about 30 days for those cows to recover. So like all of our cows, but in robots, it's more important to have consistent feeding and really consistent feed. So if you're going to make changes, you want that to happen really slow, because this is what happens, and that can be a real struggle. This is a free flow herd, and it's hard to get those cows back because, again, it's not like a parlor situation. They're going to bounce back a little bit faster because you are going to milk them whatever in 2 or 3 times a day. What are the correct feed table settings? I think we've come a long ways in the last 10 years with feed table settings. I think 10 years ago, I think often many of our farms struggled with that. They just kind of went by whatever the dealers recommended. So all the feed tables were set the same. Now I think we're tailoring those a little bit more specific farm to farm, but I'll talk about, this will be a little bit more of a philosophical discussion about how farms are doing it between guided flow and free flow farms. Typically, guided flow farms will feed much less robot pellets than free flow farms. And it's oftentimes why some of the farms put in guided flow systems. So they feed that strategy a lot more like a conventional dairy. So a lot of them will feed, you know, 1 pound to 2 pounds of robot feed per visit. And they really are just feeding that robot feed to entice the cows to visit the feeding station, milking stations. They don't really count. I mean, they obviously provide some nutrition to the cows, but that's not their ultimate goal. It's to get cows to visit the milking station. And the theory sort of is then as cows increase number of milking, so let's, for example, if I'm feeding 2 pounds per visit, my fresh cows visit 4 times, they're getting 8 pounds of robot feed. So it's not like they're getting none, but if you're only feeding 1 and you milk 4 times a day, they're really only getting about 4 pounds of robot feed per day. So it's still, you know, a pretty low percentage of dry matter, but that's kind of a typical feeding strategy. Now, free flow barns are quite a bit different. I'm going to show why I'm mentioning some of the things on this slide. Typically from calving to maybe 4 weeks or so a month, the cows are usually on a dry matter intake table. What I mean by that, for people that might not be familiar with milk tables, is basically for every day in milk or for every few days in milk, they get fed so many pounds of robot pellets. So it's going to basically be days in milk, you get X number of pounds of robot pellets, and that's going to be stepped up over that period of time. Part of the reason they want to do that, as I mentioned earlier, they don't want these fresh cows being slug fed. And so they kind of, I'll call it limit feed them almost during that first period of time. And I'll show you the data why I think 7 days is maybe where a lot of farms, or some farms are for older cows, and 28 days for younger cows. And I think oftentimes we keep them, especially older cows, multi-lactation cows, on these days in milk tables a little bit too long. But you basically step it up. After that, we basically we go to a milk production table. So then the cows are fed based on their milk production. But there's typically a lead feed factor, and that is done through peak. And I would encourage you, when you think your cows reach your peak, to switch them to a mid-lactation diet, which is where they're only fed based on milk production. Because if you feed them a lead factor too many days, say you keep them on this lead factor for 150 days, you're really wasting a lot of feed, because those cows are not, they're going to go up and down day to day, but they're not going to keep going up in milk once they're over 150 days in milk, or 100 days in milk for that matter. So that's a matter of feed cost, is when they kind of reach their peak, you need to get those switched to a milk only table. And of course, we sometimes feed these late lactation cows a different table, and a different table to heifers to allow them for growth. This is purely an example of a herd, but you can see their first lactation cows in this example, they're staying on a days in milk only for the first 3 weeks. And then they go to a milk production table with a lead factor until 75 days. and then they're going to a milk table. You can see these second and later lactation cows. In 1 week, they were going to a milk production table. And I know any farms that have robots out here realize what happens is these multiparous cows or second and later lactation cows, they adjust to robots really fast. I mean, they get in that barn and they visit well and they increase in milk production very, very rapidly. And I'll show you why I think we really need to be looking at something like this for our older cows. This is some research out of Canada. The next couple slides are Canadian studies, but subclinical ketosis was quite a bit higher in these robot herds than conventional herds. And you can imagine how that would happen if you're relying and those cows, if you're relying on the PMR and you're limiting the amount of energy and they're starting to, you know, if they're a week in milk and they're milking 140 or 150 pounds and you're just stepping this feed table up based on days in milk, they're likely not getting enough energy. Here's another study. This is a Canadian study looking at some herds, and I'll try to explain this real rapidly. The yellow line here is cows that are subclinical ketosis. These are cows that are healthy. The orange line are cows that are healthy. These lines are, the gray line is the cows that are subclinical ketosis, but they also had one other disease incident. And the blue line is other. So these are cows that had diseases, but never showed up with ketosis. And this is a milk to supplement ratio. And so you can see these cows that go up, and these are all fed about the same amount of supplement. So think about, this is the first week. Think about cows that are on this milk table that they're feeding so many pounds of supplement. Now this was multiple herds, but let's just look at how this cow, so these cows rapidly increasing in milk, a lot of milk, you're not increasing their supplement, they're subclinically ketotic. You can see these cows, of course, are sick, so they drop in milk production. You can see the healthy cows here. But this just lends credence to the fact that these cows, they're probably eating a lot of PMR. Again, if you're really watching the manure, looking their behavior, many of our robotic systems now is rumination. I think we need to kind of individualize this as much as we can for our herds, especially herd acts for these multiparous cows, because you can see these last two slides, there's some indication that if we don't get enough energy into those fresh cows that are really visiting often and really milking a lot, that it really can affect them from a health standpoint. Okay, I'm going to cover a few, I'll say reasonably new things. Do we feed more precisely with more robot pellets? And I think that's originally one of the sales pitches of these robotic robots is that, well, boy, we can really dial in. We can go back to almost our old tie stall barns where we can feed each cow individually. That may or may not be true. I'm not saying it's not true, but I think it's not always as true as we think it might be. Then do we have to feed in the robot to attract cows? Then do we have to feed pellets, or can we feed a meal? This is some of the research. This is Canadian research, and this is really hard to do because you need to be able to specifically measure PMR intake. And you can see this is a substitution ratio. So basically this number is what happened to PMR intake as you fed more robot pellets. So in the first two studies, they actually decreased, like for example, the hair study, what this means is for every 1 pound of robot pellet they ate, they decreased PMR intake 1.5 pounds. So we think they're eating this much PMR, but they may not be. And why I've got this highlighted in blue and the bottom one kind of highlighted in maroon is you look, the top two really substituted a lot. So they did not eat their PMR. But if you look at them, mid to later lactation cows, maybe not late lactation, but lower producing cows, milking 70, 80 pounds a day. If you look at these that continue to eat maybe even ate more than we had anticipated or expected of their PMR, these were higher producing cows and earlier lactation cows. So I don't think we totally understand exactly what causes a substitution ratio, but I think it's something we don't understand and we need a lot more information on, because this really could affect how many robot pellets we should feed. Such a feeding more feed in the robot, and I saw this more 4, 5, 6 years ago, where if cows weren't visiting, we'll feed them more pellets. Remember, the pellets is just an attractant to get them there. I'm not sure if there's a bowl of Snickers out on Easter. If the bowl is bigger and I eat 10 Snickers, I'm more likely to go get one than if I only get one Snicker. This is some research on the right, is a big data study with a lot of herds, some Canadian Minnesota herds, but you can see it didn't necessarily show that feeding more feed ended up with more milk per cow. This is just a summary of some trials on the left side. You can see a number of trials. So the top free flow trials, there were 5 trials included in this. One of the trials, so only 20% of them, when they fed more grain, resulted in more visits. And only 2 of them resulted in more milk production. Guided flow, 1 out of 4, so 25%, and only 1 of those ended up with more milk. So I think it's a little bit of a fallacy if cows aren't visiting like you want, to just say, well, I'll change the feed tables and I'll feed them more feed and make the assumption that they're going to come in. You might want to change the formulation. It might be lameness. There might be a lot of reasons. It might be heat abatement. Cows aren't coming. But I don't think, looking at the research, it's safe to say that just feeding more feed will get cows to visit. This is maybe another reason why we don't want to be feeding a lot of grain through the robots. This is in kilos, so you can take it by about 2. So this is the allocation to these cows, concentrate allowed through the robot. And then the left is concentrate refusals, or thinking of a feed that they did not eat. And again, not surprising, the more you feed them, the more likely they are not to eat it all. And if you're relying on that feed, if you're on a milk feed table and you're saying, okay, this cow is milking X number of pounds, so she's going to get this many robot pellets to get a balanced diet. If she's not eating that, she's likely not to milk like you expect or anticipate her. And I think that has been a trend. We're probably feeding, I know we are feeding less robot feed than we did for sure 10 years ago. Okay, meal feeding. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, because 10, 15 years ago, we tried meal feeding, and boy, it was just not very successful. We asked that question, one of our first surveys, which was, I think, 2012, so over 10 years ago, and it was pretty adamant. I tried meals, it didn't work, just tell people to feed pellets. And we heard that from virtually everybody that fed meals. And so it's interesting now, and I think part of what drove this, part of this creative farmers and say, I'm going to make this work. Part of it is a financial situation our farms have been in the last couple of years. And I think they've just said, we're going to see if we can make these pellets work. And you know, not creative nutritionists, but nutritionists are saying, yeah, we'll work with you. We'll see if we can figure it out. I'm not sure exactly why it works really now, but it's interesting that I'll talk to a lot of farms, and over the last year, we've had a lot of farms in the upper Midwest switch to a meal, and they've said, man, my visits are better, my refusals are up, my milk production is going up, and I'm saving money. You can see down this is kind of a typical from the farms I talked to. So we'll say 60 would be a lot, but 30 to 40 is real common, is how much feed costs they'll save per cow per day. So if you're not doing it, these are some of the things that I've heard visiting with a lot of nutritionists. And now, as I mentioned here, particularly in Minnesota and Wisconsin, a lot of herds are switching, and nutritionists switch them kind of slow because you never know how they're going to react, but there's a lot of them encouraging them. So you need to have a meal that flows well. And that may have been our issue a few years ago. We maybe weren't as cognizant of the challenge of getting meals through our auger systems. You need to avoid ingredients like fat and other ingredients that may limit flowability. I think flow is as much palatability, obviously, but the flowability, you must feed the amounts the cows will consume. One of the things is Cows cannot eat a meal as fast as they can eat a pellet. And you look in the bottom, I just made a little bit table here. Most of the research shows, and this is going to vary a lot from cow to cow, most of the research is going to show cows can eat about 250 grams per minute of a meal. That's about a half a pound. It's 450 grams in a pound, so maybe a little bit more than a half a pound. A pellet, the research shows they'll eat 400 to maybe 450, so almost a pound a minute. So you cannot feed as much meal as a pellet. So what I just did, I said, well, and I'm probably a little long on this. Most cows probably don't get 7.5 minutes every time they go in to eat. But I just said, if a cow's getting milked twice a day, to 8.3 pounds is a maximum amount of robot feed per day. So a little over 4 pounds per feeding if she's eating 250 grams per minute. So you can see with a pellet, they can eat quite a bit more feed, you know, a third or whatever more feed per milking or per day. So I think you really need to be cognizant of that if you're considering going to a meal, especially if you're at these higher feeding levels. Should ideally be a consistent particle size if you can. They're grinding these pretty fine. It's really finer than I would think the cows would eat it up. Success does seem to vary a little bit from herd to herd. I don't know if that's a cow or a ration formulation, but some farms try it and they go, well, this isn't really working as much as I want. One thing you will consistently notice if you talk to them, the robot room tends to be dustier because you've got dust coming down there. It's pretty common. You can see my picture, maybe not a real good picture, but if you go in these robot rooms, there'll be quite a bit more dust. So you just got to be aware of that. And then make sure you calibrate these often. You know, maybe we probably don't calibrate all of our feeders often enough, but make sure you calibrate them often. Yeah, I think this is one of the things you just really have to do is put these little vibrators. Minimize the number of right angle corners. And I think some of the farms that have gone away, just when they set up the robotic system, they have too many corners and they're too sharp and the feed just bridges up in there. So angles like 45-degree angles, if you're designing a new robot or a feeding system, I think that's really important. And then use vibrators to keep it from bridging. You could search Facebook, there's robot users group, they'll have a lot of different thoughts and opinions. But a lot of the farms here, maybe you don't have to vibrate very long. These are cheap to set up. You can buy these vibrators off of Amazon, or dealers will have them for, you know, some of the robot dealers are carrying them now. You know, 30, 40 bucks. Vibrators are just put it on a little timer. So you just get a little timing box and put it on. It vibrates a few seconds every 10 minutes or so. Over bridging, just think about a concrete vibrator. We want that concrete to settle in there hard. And so over bridging or over vibrating can also increase bridging. But I think you really need to think about where your pinch points are, and then put a little vibrator in there. And you might want to experiment where it needs to go. You know, oftentimes if you can just run an extension cord or something before you hardwire it, it might be better. But these are some pictures, compliments of a dealer here in central Minnesota. Is it possible to feed no feed through a robotic milking system? Now, I always met, you know, a lot of the ideas we get in extension, we kind of steal from other people. This has not been researched, but I just thought I'd share it because there are a couple of farms throughout the country that are trying it. And I was at a meeting a few weeks ago where this consultant, Kelly, was talking a little bit about it. And we actually went to a farm over in Wisconsin that was not feeding any pellets. So basically, these are kind of testimonials, for lack of a better term, for a couple of farms that are doing it and what are their keys. I think what are the producers' goals and expectations? As you can imagine, now you don't have the feed to entice them to go through the robots, and it's right now it's only guided flow, so you have gates that help you get there, and you can do some of these barn design things that can kind of encourage them to go through those gates. But clearly, you can see why I bolded. You've got to spend more time training cows. You've got to get them in the habit that they've got to go through this row or go through the gates to get to feed. And so that's really important, that you're likely to have a few more cows that you're going to have to be fetching, and more time is going to be spent on training than in a system where you have feed that encourages them to come. are you as a producer or the producers you're working through, are they committed to a very intensive training program that might last longer for these cows? And it's important to remember that fresh cows, especially first lactation cows, you're going to have to fetch them more often, and you're going to really have to put them through an intense training program. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Some other things is obviously the TMR needs to be really well balanced. All the nutrients come through the TMR. You probably don't want to take a mid-lactation cow or high-producing cow and say, I'm going to start this in my herd tomorrow. As of next week, my cows are not going to get any pellets. I know there's one herd, I think it's a Colorado herd, that's been kind of weaning back cows. But, you know, if you want to decrease your risk, start with newly fresh cows. So start maybe heifers or cows and try it with some of the cows and say, I'm never going to give you a pellet. The rest of the cows in your herd get pellets, but they come in, they don't get pellets. So real limited data, again, limited data shows pretty similar, at least this one herd that the data was shown on, two herds, I guess, pretty similar milkings per cow, pretty similar milk production, and no increase in incomplete. So it doesn't appear like they're really kicky. Now, there's been some discussion as I've been getting on a lot of these robot farms. Can we do this and put molasses blocks or salt blocks or something in there just to keep them occupied? But these farms aren't, because some of the cows are getting robots, but it appears they adapt pretty well. So again, limited information. I'm not necessarily here as a university person promoting that because we don't have any research right now, but this is some research, or some, not research, this is some observations, and I think it's an interesting concept. So why would we want to not feed? I mean, what would be the reason for that? I mean, theoretically, we can feed our cows more precisely, but we've got extra cost and labor in handling robot feed. I showed earlier that feeds that went to meals are saving 30 to 60 cents per day. Think about if we can feed it all through the PMR, it makes it a lot easier, right? If we just can feed a TMR to these cows. There is some data that shows, not surprisingly, what's programmed to be fed to cows is not always what's delivered if we don't have good calibration, is not what feed's always consumed. We've always talked to our conventional farms, well, we've got 3 diets on the farm, right? The one that the nutritionist balance, the one that gets mixed up, and the one that gets mixed up and delivered, and then the one the cows actually eat. Remember, you're doubling all of those errors in a robot barn. Not only do we have those same errors in the PMR, we've also got those same errors in our robot feed. So we basically double the risk of errors in all of these areas. That's what they said. And then again, the substitution rate, I showed that. It's not really well understood at this time. We think some of it's just going to be cow preference. I mean, some cows are going to like, they're going to like the PMR better. Some cows are going to like the robot feed. Some are going to go the robot feed and say, you know, a few hours, I can go to some more robot feed. I'm not going to eat much PMR. So I think it may be how good quality nutrition-wise and palatability-wise your PMR is. I said PMR diet formulation, robot pellet formulation. The other thing is the physiology. As I pointed out in that previous slide, these early lactation cows, really driven to milk, driven to eat, seems like they didn't do a lot of substituting. These later lactation cows, maybe a little bit lazier, maybe they're the ones that are saying, hey, I like this robot feed. Heck, if I'm gonna eat this PMR, I'm just gonna wait. And if you're planning on that PMR, you're predicting that PMR, you predict wrong, you're gonna hurt milk production. And then you've kind of got the normal increasing AMS concentrate increases day to day. There's just an individual cow to cow variation. So there is some logical nutrition reasons not to feed robot feed. But again, some nutritionists and farmers really like it because they can believe they can feed more precisely, maintain body condition. I'm not here to say one way is right or better, but there might be some logical reasons for some farms to consider not feeding any PMR. Okay, let's shift gears off of feeding specifically. I've got a few minutes left. Of course, obviously the key to milking success with robots, no different than a conventional farm, high milk per cow and high milk per cow per robot. And one of the keys to that is high early lactation visits, which means we need a really excellent training program for first lactation cows. You know, this was research in conventional farms, must be 15 years ago or so, that Jeff Dahl did, looking at milking 2X herds, 3X when they're fresh, 3X herds, 6X. And there was a big increase in milk production, and it stayed for a long period of time. You know, ideally, we want to milk fresh cows a lot oftener, not less often, and then get them used to going to the robot multiple times. It promotes higher total visits. We need to get the right number of cows per robot. I think that's important. We'll talk a little bit about our research related to that, and then really fine-tune robot settings. This is just some information from Mike Brook. You know, we can make this argument if we look at the top, early lactation cows. Here's some cows, average visits 2 to 4, milk production 50 to 100, essentially for heifers. Not super surprising. If you look later lactation, again, mid lactation, 4 pounds, they were still milking 100 pounds. Now we can have the debate and the argument, and nobody knows, did these cows milk more because they're visiting offer, or were they just feeling better and wanted to milk more, got around in the barn more, so they milked more because they were feeling better. So we can make that argument, but the point remains, cows that typically get milked more often give more milk. So this is some of our research looking at 2 of our trials that we did, looking at factors affecting milk per robot. And they're pretty similar with milk per cow, so there's not a lot of difference. But milking visits per day. So the more visits you can get through your robot per day, again, nothing rocket science there. More time, more cows get milk, the more milk you're going to get. Same thing for cows. Cows that visit more often get more milk. Milking speed of the cows in the robot, you can get more milk per robot. Cows per milking unit. And I'll talk a little bit of a trial. This is kind of a real balance, because we don't want so many cows that hurt our visits too much that we don't get milk. And part of that is going to be milking permission settings. Again, I'll talk to you in later slides. Automatic galley scrapers, we didn't really look at that in this trial, but this one, automatic galley scrapers, we picked up more milk. Robot feed, again, this is an association. So this may be just that the herds that got more milk per robot, the nutrition wasn't that much different, other than those cows required more robot feed. Multiple feeds in the robot, we did pick that up in one of our trials. Residual feed, this is feed that the cows were programmed to eat and did not. There's been a number of trials now that have picked that up. So again, this is feed that you think the cows are going to eat, but it's programmed for them to eat, but it didn't get dispensed to them. We don't know really how much they ate. Failed visits, more failed visits we picked up here. Refused visits, the same thing. Okay, let's look at some of the factors that affect. This is 38 free flow barns. This is a different trial that we did a little more recently. They were all the same per cow per robot, except the bottom one. I'll talk about that. And the middle one here. So not surprising. New barns versus retrofit. We both got more milk per cow, more milk per robot. They're probably better heat movement, probably better stalls, a little better designs. Milkings per day, again, nothing surprising. Cows that got milk more per day, more milkings through the robot, made more milk. Auto feed push up, that's been documented. Multiples of our study, virtually every study. This one I'd spend a little bit on, more cows per robot. And these 38 farms, more cows per robot to a point, decreased milk per cow. Remember, these are the same herds. Decreased milk per cow, but increased milk per robot. And I've got a slide a little bit later that shows kind of where we're at. It's got every cow or every herd plotted on there and cows plotted on there. So more cows per robot. You may get a decreased milk per cow, not always. You'll usually get an increased milk per robot. Okay, the other thing we picked up, we looked at where the robots were relative kind of a barn design. Robots on the end of the pens or in the middle of the pens milk more than robots on the side of the barn. And I think most robot companies and nutritionists will say it's a little bit more of a struggle getting visits and milk production on these robots that are on the side of the pen, but it's really never been documented before. So I think this is the first time that's really kind of looked where the robots are in the pen as far as getting milk production. And almost all new, these are almost all retrofits. So there might be, and we try to take that out when we run our statistics. Okay, feed table intensity. What we did is looked at the number of different feeds fed, how many different diets were a part of those feed tables, and the more intense the feed table was, those farms got a little more milk per cow. And so again, I don't know if we measured the right things. It's something we did because we saw all these different feed tables. We looked at feed tables and we looked at how many feeds they fed, so looked at that. This is the slide that I was talking about that kind of looks at cows per robot, average milk per robot. And you can see I just drew a line, a maroon line up and down here at 60 cows per robot. That's kind of been traditionally what we've talked about. And you can see we've got a lot of farms up here with lots of milk, lots of cows per robot. We got one up here, and this is a year's worth of data. And so it's not like it's just, one day's worth of data. There's some herds. The one I talked to, I think he'll admit he's got too many, but he's consistently up here at high 70 cows per robot. That's a free flow system. But you can see we got a lot of cows clustered here between 60 and 70 that are high milk per robot. And a lot of these in this area, 60 to 65 particularly, will get a lot of milk per cow. It can take you to a lot of these that are approaching or maybe even over 100 pounds per cow. Again, I'll talk on a couple of slides exactly what I think it takes to do that. But I think you can see clearly there's a correlation with milk per robot and kind of cows per robot. I'm not here to tell you what the right number is for your herd. Okay, increasing cows per robot. If you're thinking, okay, Jim, what do I need to do this? And kind of general guidelines is when we look at it, free time will decrease. It almost always, well, it does. Time's got to come from somewhere. On an average, fewer milkings per cow. But as I mentioned, there are herds that get as much milk per robot and per cow, as much milk per cow with fewer milkings per cow. And the key there is getting the right cow's milk at the right time. I'm not convinced you need to average even 3 milkings per cow. And again, it depends on your goal. But if you get all your fresh cow's milk 4 times and your late lactation cow's milk twice, and you're averaging 3, I think you can average a lot of milk per robot. So there's a lot of herds I work with that are 2.7, 2.8, 2.9. They're averaging extremely high milk production per cow. Not telling you what the right number is for your herd, but it's not an automatic that more milkings per cow will necessarily get you more milk. Number of fetch cows will typically decrease. You hear increase. You'll hear that real common, particularly 2-year-olds. If you want to make this work really well, have a separate 2-year-old pen, maybe some young 3-year-olds in there to train those 2-year-olds, but that makes it work much better. If you've got mixed lactation pens, those heifers struggle if you really push up those numbers. As I mentioned earlier, you need to have the right milking permission settings to make this work, so you don't over milk those late lactation cows. You've got to have the right kind of cows. You're not going to do this first year you're in a robot barn. You're not going to run 70 cows per robot because you need cows that milk fast. You need cows that are really well behaved in the robot, and you need cows that you need a fast attach time to those cows. What are some of the challenges is with adding a lot of robots? Robot breakdowns get you behind really fast. So you better have somebody on your farm that knows how to fix those robots and kind of get them figured out. And there are some farms we work with that they know they have 20% free time. They're happy with it. They maybe have a lot of enterprises going on, or lifestyle is really important to them. And I'm not going to deny that to anybody. So I'm not saying you have to go there. Just warning you is you better stay on top of these robots, because if they're broke down, you really get behind fast if you've got a lot of milk per robot. First lactation cows, as I mentioned earlier, you really probably need those in a separate pen. And then robots really need to be kept working well, clean, maintained, udder singed, everything you can do to help those robots out. Okay, I'll just talk a little bit about heifers. Let's get our heifers off to a really good start. This is some research we had. There's some research out of Germany that kind of showed they looked at it a little differently, a lot less fetching in their fresh heifers. Makes sense. This is kind of a retrospective study looking at the yellow barns are 1 year when they trained robots. The not trained ones it's a different time frame. So this isn't a controlled study at the same time. But if you look at it again, not surprising. Basically, this farm walks cows through their robot. Their close-up pens are right next to the robot in the same barn. So they walk them through, and you can see really pretty substantially better visits in those heifers pretty consistently, basically almost a pound or one more visit per cow per day. So let's talk a little bit about training heifers. I think the key is I think of it as a training program, not a fetching program. So you need to practice the behavior you want those cows to achieve. And I said early lactation visits mean early lactation early, mean early lactation visits late, means high milk production. So the first few days, teach them about the entire pen. You know, walk them in that pen. Maybe it's just the heifers, show them where the waters are, just kind of teach them how to get around. Remember, think of this as a training program, a teaching program, not fetch them. And I know most farms, if you're a smaller farm, you're only going to fetch your standard fetch morning and evening. If you're a large farm now, there's larger farms that fetch multiple times per day. But then if you can, if somebody's around, fetch those heifers 1 or 2 times in between. Ideally, not the same time of day, but just kind of make sure you get in, keep an eye on those heifers. If you have a separate pen, that's a real advantage of having a separation pen where you kind of train your heifers. It's easy to go in, it's easy to get them. They're not struggling with so many other cows, but set them on a real intense training program. And then move slow. You don't want to go in, get this heifer, walk behind her, chase her to the robot. You're teaching her to be a chronic fetch cow when she sees you. So you got to be a little bit stealthy in this and kind of guide them to the robot. You know, get a broom or a rake or whatever you use, scrape out some stalls and kind of try to not let them know it's only them. You kind of want to guide them up by that robot, and when they get closer, go, I'm here. Make sure they have room and access. So I think this is just thinking a little bit like you're this cow and what's going to encourage you to behave and go to that robot often. And I think if you fetch them 3 or 4 times a day, they're going to think, you know, they sort of internal clocks, right? Just like us, wake up at the same time in the morning. They kind of have internal clocks that like, well, okay, I guess it's been X number of hours. I guess it's time for me to go to the robot. So think a little strategically about that. Keys to success, dealing with the imperfections of robots. I used to get a lot of calls from farmers. My robots aren't working well. My robots aren't working well. I'll talk a little bit about that in a couple slides. But just accept the fact robots are getting much better, but they're not as good as a good human in prepping and dipping. They're just not. So you need to make sure you don't have chapped teats in the winter. Hopefully you're using good teat dips. If you're in cold weather like us, it's a little bit more of a challenge dealing with milk quality and mastitis, particularly these contagious organisms. So ideally you want to get those identified. Ideally, you don't want to have too many in your farm. If you've got a big Staph aureus problem, I think you need to deal with that problem before you move into your robotic dairy if you can. Some cows don't read the book and behave like they hope. You'll have cows that are milking 150, 170 pounds a day, and they're going to get milk twice a day, and you can fetch them 3 times a day, and they're determined they're only going to milk twice a day. So they just don't behave like they should. Training heifers can be a pain. I guess I've talked about that already. Alarms are a pain. Not too bad. I mean, the robots are better, but they're going to wake you up in the middle of the night. Maintenance is expensive, but it's really important for maximum performance. So it's one of those things, it's just the cost of doing business with a high technology piece of equipment. Light quarters, I'll show you a picture a little bit later. And then it does take a different skill set, both employees and managers. Okay, this is just a couple of pictures. This is some prep. Here's a cow. You know, I'm not sure. Her udder got sanitized. This is post dipping, but her teats didn't get much spray on them. Over here, this cow, I couldn't get my video up fast enough. You never can. But this cup actually attached to the side of the udder. It didn't prep the teat. It thought it prepped the teat, but it actually attached to the side of the udder. This was interesting. I was on a farm and this cow had failed. And we were doing a project on the farm and he said, this cow always fails. If you just be from the outside looking at this udder, you go, wow, that's a nice robot udder. Really doesn't have a reverse tilt. Teats are spread out nice. But look at this. And this is what I would get calls on. People would send me videos. This back right quarter is a little bit light. And that's the one that always fails. When we were watching there, and I've actually got a little video if I had time to show it, but it misses this back right teat. And he said that happens all the time. And it's just because I think, so if you've got cows and you're moving to the robotic system and you've got a kind of lopsided udders, I'm not saying you have to kill those cows. I'm not saying you have to do anything other than don't be surprised if those robots have a little bit of a challenge. And again, new robots are getting much, much better at this. Okay, the other thing, kind of wrapping up here, optimized box time, efficient robot use. We want so carefully thought out. I've kind of harped this to death, thought out milking permission settings, cows that attach fast, cows that milk time, optimized free time. Kind of in summary, we want high milk production per cow and per robot. How are we going to get that? We're going to have well-balanced diets. All of these really are the same as we'd have in a conventional herd, right? Well-balanced diets, high-quality forage, really good transition program. Robots, we want high visits and early lactation. We want to get our cows pregnant. We want really good cow comfort. We want a low somatic cell count. Labor is going to continue to be a challenge. I don't have to tell anybody that, whether you're a dairy farmer or not. It does require really good management, a little different management than a conventional system. I talked about this already. Help your robot succeed. Help it as much as you can. Barn design, cleanliness, get the right kind of cows, good milking settings, and it takes a whole system for success, and you have to make these cash flows work. It's an expensive milking system, and it's an entire system. So you're going to put in automatic manure removal. You're going to do a lot of those things that will add cost to your system. With that, I'm done. Abby, you can come back on and we can answer some questions and have a discussion.
Thank you, Jim, for that presentation. I know that robotic milking is an area that you and some of your colleagues at the University of Minnesota have been looking at and working with farmers. So I appreciate you being able to share some of the knowledge that you have gleaned over the years, and I know you'll continue to do that. I also want to thank AMS Galaxy for sponsoring this program. If you'd like to learn more about their company and their products, please look them up online. To view this webinar or any of our previous webinars, you'll be able to find them in our archive, which is available at hordes.com/webinars. This particular presentation should be posted later this week. Check our sponsor out online, and then you can view any of our past webinars on our website. We hope that you'll make plans to attend our next webinar, which will take place in June. We will have Dr. Mike Hutchins from the University of Illinois. He'll be here to talk with us about feed additives. And then in July, Carl Berge from the Save Cows Network and the Dairyland Hoof Care Institute will be with us to talk about hoof care. Now, Jim, we had a few questions that came in, so I will go through those now. The first one, what level of fetch cows is a concern? Like what should be the norm?
What's normal? Again, if you look at the research, it's going to say 10%, but I think a lot of that varies from farm to farm. I mean, if you have a real intense fetching schedule and you don't care, if you talk to a lot of farms, they'll say 10 to 15%, but they'll also say, I don't have to fetch that many cows. And I think about fetch cows in different categories. Again, I wouldn't put my training in those fetch cows. I wouldn't put a lame cow in that fetch cow. I'd say, how many cows are a surprise fetch cow that she's never on my list, she's not named, she's not healthy, I'm not training her, and I would think you would want that number maybe 1 to 2%, maybe 1 or 2 per robot. If you have more than that, I think you really need to be thinking about it, but kind of take out these cows that you think, yeah, she's a fetch cow, but there's another reason she's a fetch cow. So other than if I take all of those out, so true fetch cows, and there might be a couple late lactation cows in there, but 1 to 2 cows, you shouldn't have more than that per robot.
We have a couple questions here related to feeding. So This one says, have there been any studies done related to the frequency of feeding the partial mixed ration? So how many times you deliver feed in the barns per day?
Well, I don't think specifically with robots, but I think if you talk to researchers, they would tell you to feed TMR twice a day. Now we've got the vector feeding systems, or those automatic feeding systems. That happens to be Lely's brand. There are other brands out there with those automatic feeding systems that kind of feed every time the bunk is low. You know, the limited research that is done with those show that those robot barns that have those have more refusals. So not necessarily more milk, not necessarily more milkings, but remember that's set by milking permission settings more than anything. But the cows clearly seem to be more active. And I think that's why if you can, ideally feed your PMR twice a day, because then it just makes your cows more active, they get up more. I think the data will also show at some point it's like feed push-ups. At some point cows look at the feeder and they go, well, I don't know, there's feed there, he comes the feed pusher. It really helps push it up because it keeps feed in front of the cows, but I would say twice, but no robot specifically, other than those vector feeding studies. There's been a couple of those done, and they'll show you get more refusals and more visits to the robot because the cows are a little more active if you feed more often.
Okay. A lot of what you talked about, that management is similar whether you're in a robot barn or a conventional barn. So keeping the feed in front of the cows is important no matter what the setting is. This question is from a listener in the Netherlands. We appreciate all of our attendees that tune in from around the world at all different times of the day. They said that they're feeding from 2 up to 9 kilograms in the robot feed, kind of, I guess, stepping up the first 21 days, and then after 60 days in milk, they switch to the milk feed table. So they're saying 9 kilograms, about 18 pounds. Is that too much feed in the robot, or is there a problem with feeding that much feed in the robot?
You know, I've spoke overseas, and that tends to be a trend over there where they feed very little grain, and I think they believe it helps visits and drive cows to the robot. And so if you want my opinion, yeah, I would try to back that off and do it really slow. I'd be interested, and they have really good components over there, but that seems to be, you know, more of what they do over in Europe. And I think if you're having really good luck with it and everything's balanced out fine, and I'm not sure what's in your robot pellets, maybe if you have a lot of, you know, digestible fiber or something in there, that's not going to cause some challenge. My biggest concern would be is I just think, are they eating all of it, or can cows get that much? So if they visit a couple less times a day, are they not getting a lot of that feed they need? So I'll just say, I think here farms are much more comfortable feeding maybe a peak of, now most farms are maybe at 6 kilos. Some will be at 7 for really high producing cows. But yeah, you know, if you ask my opinion or what some of the research is showing, they're saying, yeah, I think you can get as good a performance with maybe a little less feed through the robot. And it's going to save you some money.
Thank you. Another question here. What about feeding or choosing how much you're feeding the cows in the robot based on fat and protein corrected milk? Would there be a benefit to that?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if the robot companies can do that yet, where they actually I think that's where we're going to head. I mean, obviously there's a different, say you had Jerseys, and you probably put a separate Jersey feed table, Jerseys versus Holsteins, or even Holsteins now, you know, or some are, you know, averaging a 4 or 5 fat test and a 3.8. I think that's one of the advantage of robotic dairies, right? We can fine tune that. And I'm assuming your nutritionist is balancing it for your particular herd's components. But yeah, of course, there's an advantage to that if you can do it.
Mm-hmm. Kind of two sort of related questions. One, how many milkings per day is too many milkings per day? I mean, what do you see for an upper limit on some of the farms you work with?
You know, it's an interesting question. We have this once in a while talking about teat end damage. You know, can you get too much teat end damage? And I'm not a you know, you need to talk to somebody that's an expert on milking equipment, milking times. But I think they would say if the milk is let down really properly, you're probably not going to get teat end damage. I don't, you know, I didn't show this slide today, but I've got he's a friend of mine from Wisconsin that's a really good thinker, and his idea was, and I think he would admit now it's too much. I think it's what's the right amount of milk a cow should give when she comes into the robot. And I think his idea was 40 pounds or will be 20 kilos. I think that's too much, particularly for 2-year-olds. But I don't think we want cows coming into the robot probably milking much less than maybe 12 to 15 kilos when she comes in. And so I think that's what would determine to me. If I had a cow milking, you know, I run across this once in a while, milking 100 kilos or 200 pounds, I don't think milking her 5 times a day is a problem, quite frankly. I don't know if there'd be any reason to milk a cow more than 5 times a day. It just seems like to me 6 times a day, maybe on a fresh cow, but I would see no reason you'd want, you know, you don't want a cow with tying up robot time. So I would think about how much you want her to give every time she comes in. And I think a lot of farms now want to average like 30 pounds, 25 to 30, and that's an average. So remember, not every cow is going to be there. So 25 to 35 pounds every time they come in, I think is a pretty good target for most farms.
You tied in really great to the next question that was asked, and this isn't necessarily robot related, but do you think there's an upper limit of what cows should be or can be producing? They're saying, you know, you hear of cows that are said inching towards that 200, you know, if they're milking 200 pounds a day, not, you know, where is our limit of how much milk cows should be making per day?
You know what? I would think we have this, you know, this is an academic discussion, right? And there's a academic that argues, yes, at some point, cells can only work so fast. But maybe we saw that 100 years ago. I guess I remember the first time we collected our robot data back in 2012, and I had a colleague that was looking at it. I went to most of these farms and said, we got some mistakes here. There's something wrong here. We got a cow that's milking 200 pounds a day. There must be wrong with the data collection. And I just laughed because I was on that farm, and the farmer said, I got to show you this. I got to show you this. And it was about 2 or 3 days in a row. So it wasn't a weird kind of a thing. So I just laughed and they said, no, that cow milked 200 pounds a day. And then that's not real. That's $1 million question. Man. If you look at what these world record cows produce, if you do the math on how much fat or protein they make per day, I'm getting a little preachy here, but they are absolutely metabolic wizards. I don't know how they do it. That'd be like me running a 2-minute mile. I don't know. So is there an upper limit? I would guess at some point, doesn't there sort of have to be? This is kind of, again, a philosophical discussion, but you'll get cows milking 200 pounds in a robot or in a conventional farm. We see it too. It's amazing to me. But I would suspect eventually cows can only eat so much and they can only be so efficient. So I would think there could be, but I don't know what that is.
Certainly a perfect mixture of genetics, feed, management, the right cow in the right place. Let's see.
Yeah, I would never imagine. I go to farms now where the cows average, there's a big herds, average 110 pounds a day, 4.3, 4.4 fat tests, 3.4 proteins.
Yeah, very impressive.
Yeah, low cows are milking 90, 80. Anyway, sorry, I got a little preachy here, but that's unbelievable to me. Just blows my mind.
Exactly. So this question says, what do you think about feeding more quantity of pellets in the first 90 days, pellets with a lower starch level and higher fat content?
You know, that's a really good, and he's a really smart guy. He's got his PhD and he also milks cows here, and he works for one of the software companies. And he feeds, it's a meal, and he feeds corn gluten pellets. Well, if you understand those two products from a nutritionist standpoint, corn gluten pellets are high in energy, but very low in starch. And then his other feed is high in starch. And so he switches those. I know Michigan State has been doing some research in conventional herds and saying cows have very different nutrient requirements throughout lactation. And so that's a little bit what he's doing. So, and he's working, the cows are milking really well. I mean, you're talking 100 pounds of fat corrected milk on a regular basis. So I'm really intrigued to look more on why he does that. And he's a really sharp guy. But I get to your point. If your nutritionist is willing to try that, one of the challenges is a little bit, I've had this discussion with a researcher out of Canada, should we be feeding two different major feed qualities? Well, the challenge is when you switch cows from one to the other, they may go off feed. So what he does is he kind of had these two feeds and then he just switches the ratios of each of them. So I'm really intrigued with that idea. So if I'm a bold nutritionist and a bold farmer, I would visit with my nutritionist about trying something like that and having really different diets, feed some of each, and then switching those ratios as cows go across in lactation. I think there's some good physiological reasons to potentially do that, if that's really the question.
Yeah, thank you. Last question, you talked quite a bit about training heifers, and I know I was on a dairy a couple of years ago and they had an old robot in the heifer pen as they said, just to get them more familiar with it. On farms that you think do a really good job of training heifers, I mean, how are they doing it? Like, how long are they doing it before calving, or is there something in particular you think really helps?
You know, that's a really good question. There was a farm we were at a few years ago. This will be a longer story to your answer. There was a farmer a few years ago that they were breeding heifers in pasture in a bull. They wanted to breed AI, so they just threw them in their robot barn at breeding time and just left them in there. They put the collars on, they could catch them, right? They bred them in there. Then they turned them back out to pasture. They swear those heifers were better trained when they calved, even though they had been in that robot barn for maybe a month, 9 months before that, okay? There are farms, the farm we talked about with our project, they're unique, right? They do it for a couple of weeks, twice a day. There are other farms, as you mentioned, Abby, there's a few farms that have these phantom stalls in close-up pens, and they chase them through there, give them a little bit of pellets. There's other farms, and some farms are seeing this data and go, what can I do? There's a farm I was at in the last month or two. When they bring their cows into the close-up pen or their heifers into the close-up pen, they'll walk them through the robot for, it's just a couple of days, 2, 3, 4 days before they put them in that close-up pen permanently, kind of their calving pen, and they think that really helps. So I think anything you can do helps. Remember, the idea is for them to just get used to the noises and the sounds and walking. So to answer your question, I don't think it needs to be very long. I don't think it needs to be a lot of days. I don't think it needs to be right before they calve. I think anything you can do to get them used to the sights and sounds of that robot, whenever you can do it, farms are trying it all. And I guess I got to trust the farmers that say, yeah, I think that's really helping. So I think there's lots of ways to do it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that insight. And thank you for answering this group of questions. We had some really good questions that came in from the audience. So thank you all for participating. We hope that you'll make plans to attend our next webinars. As always, they're on the second Monday of each month. Next month in June, we'll be talking about feed additives. And then in July, we will talk about hoof care. I'd like to thank Jim Salfer from the University of Minnesota for sharing his information and insights on feeding cows and managing cows in robotic milking systems. And of course, I want to thank our listeners. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We appreciate you tuning in, and we hope that you gain something that you can use on your dairy or the dairies that you work with. And we hope to see you in the audience for a future program as well. Until next time, goodbye from all of us here at Hord's Dairyman.